Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Talent Parent Programme SmartHer webinar. So this webinar is all about the exercising female athlete and how to capitalise and cope with their physiology and psychology in the context of sport. So my name is Daniel Thompson and I'm the Talent Operations Coordinator for British Canoeing. So delivering this webinar remotely this evening will be Dr. Emma Ross, who is the Head of Physiology at the English Institute of Sport. So hopefully you should be able to hear myself, and as we progress through this webinar, you should be able to see the presentation as well. So for those of you that haven't accessed the webinar before, may I ask that you've got yourself muted and that your camera is turned off during the presentation. So there should be a red mic button to enable that. So there's also a chat feature on the top, which is sort of a speech bubble. That will allow you to drop a message to, that all attendees can see during the presentation, but there'll be an opportunity to ask questions to Emma relating to this topic area at the end of the presentation. So before we begin, just a reminder to parents that each month we hope to upload more information and resources onto the Talent Parent Programme website to help better engage and support yourselves as parents in the role that you play in the development of our Talent Programme athletes. So any new topic areas that we'll explore will be delivered in webinar format, and then our podcast series will explore last year's topic areas in more detail. So welcome to tonight's SmartHer webinar. Without further ado, I'll pass you over to Emma. So hopefully, Emma, you can hear me.
Yes, hi Daniel.
Great, yeah, over to you then, Emma. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for having me, and thank you for giving up your time this evening to listen to what I've got to share. So, as Daniel said, my name's Emma Ross, and I'm the Head of Physiology at the English Institute of Sport. And for the past about 3 years, I've been developing and leading the SmartHer programme, which really aims to improve our understanding and support of female athletes within our world-class programmes. And as well as that, I also run my own company, Thrive Revolution, which is about delivering the same education and awareness as I do in world-class sport, but across all of the pathway and even into schools. Allowing females to thrive. So I spend most of my time talking about this stuff, and I'm really pleased to be able to talk to you this evening, particularly talking to you as parents, because I spend a lot of time talking to coaches and helping them develop their understanding of the female part of the female athlete. But we know that when girls and young women have questions about stuff that happens to them being a female through adolescence, through puberty and beyond, they will go to their peers and they will go to their parents before they go to anyone else. So getting in front of the athletes themselves and getting in front of parents is really important to me, because that's where the education hopefully will have a lot of impact. So I've got about half an hour with you today, and so that is a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but I will hopefully at least ignite your curiosity and give you some context into why we think it's important to look at the female athlete in more detail. Let me just see if I can move my screen on. Seems to have frozen. Oh no, there we go, we're back. So the one thing I want to get across to you today is why it's important we look at female athletes as both females and athletes, because we know a lot about how we train and prepare athletes for peak performance. But unfortunately, there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to that. And we know treating athletes as individuals is important, regardless of whether they're male or female. But there are some specific female factors which we really need to understand to get the best out of our female athletes. And so I hope you come away from today's talk at least understanding why we need to look at some of these female specific factors when we're thinking about coaching our female athletes and supporting them to fulfill their performance potential. And one of the major differences between males and females is the sex hormones that we have that influence all of our physiology. So hormones are absolutely amazing. They are the signals that our body sends around itself to tell lots of different parts to do different things. And let's think of a hormone that we all would know the effects of, like adrenaline. So when a car backfires, down the street, and we get a surge of adrenaline, we can feel our heart rate increase. We can feel, our blood flow increasing. Our blood flow is actually increasing to our muscles in case we need to run away. Our pupils are dilating. Glucose is being made more readily available. So that one hormone affects loads of different systems in our body. And the same goes for our sex hormones. And one of the major differences between men and women is that we have more of certain hormones than each other. So we all have estrogen and testosterone, males and females, but women have much more estrogen than men, and men have much more testosterone than women. And there's also another important sex hormone called progesterone, which women have much more of than males. And these hormones influence us in so many ways. There's receptors for these hormones from places like our brain through to our digestive system, in our muscles, and all over our body, which mean that when you have higher levels of them, they're going to influence you in a different way than, let's say, a man is being influenced by lower levels of them. So that alone makes males and females very different specimens. And when we're talking about athletes, we're always trying to work with their physiology. We're trying to train them so their physiology adapts. We're trying to recover them so their physiology recovers. Their physiology is all about how their body is working to help them perform in the way they do. And when you've got things like these hormones which have a significant effect on that physiology, it's really important we consider them. And then let's layer into that the sort of added complexity that these hormones aren't just high in women and low in men, but they are higher and lower in women at different times of their monthly menstrual cycle. So the graph that I've just popped up at the bottom there is just a sort of simple outline of what the menstrual cycle looks like in terms of the levels of these hormones as a woman works across the duration of her menstrual cycle. And we'll talk a bit more in detail about this in a few minutes' time, but I just wanted to kind of put into context that as well as having much more of these hormones than males, women also go through periods of peaks and troughs of the hormone across about a month, which makes their influence sometimes very significant and sometimes not significant at all. So you can see just from that graph, there are times when both hormones are very low, sometimes when one hormone is much higher than another, and sometimes when hormones are both high. And how we feel as women in those phases will be very reflective of the fact that those hormones are peaking and troughing. And I'll go into that in a bit more detail. But it just shows that our hormones are going to be very influential as females in influencing our physiology, but also therefore our psychology. And there are other reasons that are connected to, but not specifically about the hormones that I've just mentioned, estrogen and testosterone. Women and men are different. They are physically different. So you can see here the skeletal development of males and females is very different. And that will be in part due to the presence of high levels of testosterone in males as they're developing. And when I say developing, I mean from about 7 weeks when during the pregnancy. So they develop differently. They have larger skeletons. They are always taller. In general, I'm talking about, you're always going to get shorter men and taller women, but in general, men are taller than women. Their limbs are longer, so they're long bones, those arm and leg bones, they're longer, so they have longer levers, which is important in sport. They have more muscle mass because testosterone helps develop muscle mass. And that is important in sport because suddenly we've got two people, male and a female, who have developed very differently. And when we're coaching them and we're asking them to do a particular skill, for example, if we ask them to do it in the same way, we might be setting one of those up to fail because the way in which they are going to be able to complete a skill to get the same outcome might need to be different given that their mechanics are very different. And there's a study which showed, gives a nice picture of how muscle cross-sectional area and then also grip strength, this was done in the forearms, changes across the developing years in boys and girls, but also how it differs between men and women. So you can see that in both men and women, strength will increase as they get older, and we would expect that to happen. But you can see that at all times, men or boys have greater amount of muscle and can exert more force with that muscle. And actually, over their developing years, they have a sort of more significant rise in the amount of muscle, the cross-sectional area of muscle, and the amount of force they can produce with that muscle than women. So when I was looking for a picture to put in about grip strength and forearm strength, the thing that kept coming up was Popeye, and I'd never really noticed that Popeye does have these humongous forearms, and then his lady friend Olive, that's her name, isn't it? She doesn't. So, you know, maybe they knew what we were researching all along. So all of these things are really important, and the reason I put the tennis picture up there is because I heard a great story from a tennis coach very recently, which sort of epitomized why these differences are really important for us to consider when we're coaching young athletes who are female versus male. So in tennis, the top about, let's say, 50 women have managed to hit their forehand as fast as the men's game. So you've got now men and women, top athletes in tennis, hitting the forehand at the same to achieve the same ball speed. But they are two different mechanical beings. The man is taller, he has got longer limbs, and he's got more muscle mass. So the way in which the woman has to produce her shot to get the same outcome looks very different. And when you examine how our top female athletes and our top male athletes in tennis hit the forehand, it looks very different. And that's brilliant, because women have worked out a way to use their anatomy and their biomechanics to create enough power through the ball to generate the ball speed that men are generating, because they have an advantage. They are stronger and they're taller. But what's happening down the pathway is that tennis coaches are still coaching the forehand swing as they know it to be performed by the men, because that in the coaching model, that's what we've done forever. And so what they're doing is they're coaching girls this big forehand, loopy forehand, when actually the women need to do a shorter, punchier stroke. And the girls are failing. They're failing to get the outcome that the boys are getting because they don't have the biomechanics to be able to achieve it. And so, you know, in the extreme example, you've got girls who are failing and leaving the sport because they don't think they're very good, whereas actually the coaching techniques haven't been modified for the female anatomy, the female biomechanics, the female musculature. So again, just another example of where, when we're thinking about working with male and female athletes, we do need to consider these differences if we're going to really optimize our support of them, whether that's through coaching or through sports science and medicine. And we should also talk about how women and men think. Now, there's lots of myths, I guess, about, you know, men are from Mars, women are from Venus. And we've woven into that is probably some truth. So there's still no consensus about whether the brain of a woman and a man differs significantly in terms of kind of what it looks like. But certainly we do know that whether it's by nature or nurture, even if it's by the sort of social influences we are exposed to as we grow up, our brains do develop slightly differently. And again, we're talking on average here, so there will always be people who sit slightly outside of this norm. But there was a big study done at the University of Cambridge which showed, and it used about 250,000 participants, which showed that on average, women are more empathetic than men, and men have a more systematic way of thinking. They like process and logic. And that's really important when you think about coaching women and girls in sport, because we've spoken to male coaches who have coached men and then moved over to coaching women, and they know the stark differences between how they have to communicate, the different ways they might have to motivate athletes. So, for example, one coach would say, when I asked my male team to give me aggression when they were playing, they knew exactly what that means, and I got what I wanted, I saw what I wanted. When I asked women to do that, I didn't get the outcome I was expecting. I didn't see more aggressive play, and I had to talk to them in a different way to explain what I wanted. And I also had to use different kind of cues. So women, being more empathetic, are much more likely to play for other people, for their teammates, for that social network, to, you know, to strengthen that. And so using that as a motivating tool, rather than just the process of, I need you to do this so you can achieve this, worked better with a group of females than it did with a group of males. And so it's just worth thinking about. There won't be a one size fits all in how you communicate with and coach and motivate athletes. We know that's going to be different across the lifespan with developing athletes versus mature athletes, but also it will be different between males and females. And if you add into that, we know that we know that women are twice as likely to experience depression. They're twice as likely to experience post-traumatic stress disorder, and they're twice as likely to experience anxiety as men. So they have a greater propensity for mental health issues, and those can be related to specific times and phases. But one of those is menstruation, as in either premenstrually or during the period. Now that happens every month, so that's not just one acute phase like pregnancy might be, or like post-pregnancy might be. That's happening every month. And whilst mental health issues are probably an extreme version, that data also suggests that women and girls will experience perhaps more of an emotional roller coaster, if you like, and might go through phases of feeling more sensitive to emotions, or feeling more sensitive in general. And you know, there's that old cliche of women being emotional, and it's true, and I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. I mean, we've often used males' hormones in sport to our advantage. So when you see rugby players running out onto a pitch, thumping their chests and shouting, that's a method of priming. So that's causing their testosterone to spike. They are artificially trying to create their body to release more testosterone, because they know that testosterone will help them in their game of rugby or whatever it is. Testosterone makes you more confident. It gives you more self-esteem. It makes you more aggressive. It makes you want to be more dominant. And people use that to their advantage in sport. We don't necessarily say men are hormonal when they run on a rugby pitch, but that's exactly what they are. And so there's no reason why we can't use some of these things to our advantage, as well as them posing challenges. But in terms of this kind of emotional piece, what I always say to coaches and athletes and anyone working around the athlete is, if you've got an athlete who has periods of being more sensitive, emotional, more vulnerable, more anxious, you either choose to work with that, or you choose every month to spend 2 or 3 days with your messaging, your communication, maybe falling on deaf ears, maybe not being effective, maybe even having a negative effect. And outside of that time, it might often be a really positive process to explore with an athlete who looks like that, who does have an emotional period of their cycle, for example, what needs to be done differently. So you might find that motivating your athlete, your daughters, works really well in a given way. You know, maybe it's you being really stern and strict with her, or maybe it's using like shouting, or and maybe for a couple of days a month that doesn't work, and that causes her to withdraw inside herself. So what about saying, on those couple of days, how do I get the best out of you? How can I communicate with you best to allow you to feel motivated or to feel confident about your event, rather than just accepting that it's a time when things aren't working out? So one of the other added layers of complexity we have in this area is that, as well as having different hormones, having fluctuating hormones across a monthly cycle, having different biomechanics and anatomy and physiology, and even how we think, is that we don't actually know much about the female athlete. So there's been a few studies which have tried to look at how much work has been done, how much research has been done on female athletes, or on females and sports performance. And the number is always less than 10% and sometimes low as 4% of the studies which look at sports performance. So that might be nutrition related to sports performance, might be recovery, it might be training. 4% of the research is done exclusively on females. So we understand very little about how this sort of complex physiology and all these fluctuating hormones actually influences a female athlete and her preparation for and her performance. We don't know. Now, a large number of these studies are done in both men and women, and the reason that's not very useful is you can't just clump together men and women and take the outcomes of that experiment as being applicable to men and women. In fact, it's pretty much useless for everybody because, as I've showed you, everyone's physiology is so different. So we need more research on women. We need more research on women that looks at them across the whole menstrual cycle when those hormones are low and when they're high, because we know that those hormones affect all the different things that we're investigating when we research sport and performance, yet we haven't taken them into account. And that's part of the work that we're doing at the EIS, is to try and create more research and more knowledge, because one of the things that we're finding with educating people in why it's important to consider the female physiology is the questions that come next are, okay, great, so what can I do? When can I train where it's better for my female athlete to gain strength? And where can I train where she might be better at doing endurance exercise and using fuel appropriately? And we don't have the answers to a lot of those questions yet because there's a big gap in the sports performance research. And we're working on that. But we do have data on what our athletes say, and I'm going to present some data now which is either collected from a survey that we've done with our world-class athletes, or there have been bigger surveys, and the data from on this slide comes from a bigger survey done by Strava, which is the fitness social platform, which asks exercising females whether they thought the menstrual cycle affected their ability to train or perform, and whether they knew enough about it. And as you can see here, the data suggests that for most female athletes or exercising females, their menstrual cycle affects whether they can give 100% in training or performance. And most of those have never had any education about how their biology affects their physiology, affects their behavior, affects their performance. And that's really important because we kind of often take for granted, because this stuff is happening to us as women, we're having a menstrual cycle, we're feeling all the things we feel, that we know about it. But when we get taught at school, we get taught about the sort of reproductive organs, where they are, what they do, how a baby is made, why we have a period, but we don't ever really get past that sort of first level of information. We don't get to the part where we talk about how it will make you feel, how it will affect your emotions, how it could affect you as an athlete. So that's someone who's pushing their body to the limits, on a regular basis, someone who needs to fuel effectively, to recover effectively. How does the menstrual cycle affect all of those things? Because it does, and we don't often tell our girls much about that. And that's what we're trying to put right with some of this education. So I am going to spend a bit more time talking about the menstrual cycle. I'd spend a lot of time talking about it. So why not now? Because for anyone who's not taking hormonal contraception, who is within their reproductive years, so they've had their first period and it's before they've had the menopause, they will be experiencing a menstrual cycle on, as I said, about a monthly basis. And the fluctuations of these hormones will really affect them in how they feel, how they behave, and also will also interact with the kind of context of their life. And I'll go on to talk about how individual this is, but it's worth stressing that every woman's lived experience of the menstrual cycle is unique, because it will be unique to what her hormonal profile looks like. We've done lots of research looking at these hormones across individuals' menstrual cycles, and even though everyone follows the same sort of pattern, some people's peaks are really, really high and other people's peaks aren't so high at all. Other people follow this typical pattern very nicely. Some people have a slight shift in where all of these peaks and troughs are occurring. So everyone's production of their hormones is slightly different, which will mean that will have a different effect on them. And also the context of everyone's lives is different. So someone will be experiencing stress, and someone, will be experiencing grief, and someone will be experiencing excitement, and that will all interact with all of this stuff. So how we experience the cycle is very individual, and it can differ across months for an individual. But if we just look at the cycle, let's start with this first phase. So the whole point is worth remembering. The whole point of the menstrual cycle is to allow a female to become pregnant. Every month it's saying, here's an egg, get it fertilized, let's get pregnant, and let's procreate our genetic code and the human race. Now, obviously, every month is not a great, we're not always thinking about getting pregnant. So, but the hormones are still making us kind of serving evolution in that way. They're serving us, and they're telling our body to do things that would allow us to get pregnant and to sustain a pregnancy. So, for example, in the first phase of the cycle, that follicular phase, there is a rise in estrogen. That's the blue line you can see rising up there. Now, what estrogen is doing on a biological level is it's thickening the lining of the uterus so that when the egg becomes fertilized, it can implant nicely to start the pregnancy. Estrogen is rising because it's being produced by the follicle in our ovaries, which contains the egg, which is about to be released. And this is all signaling that the menstrual cycle is kind of going to progress to ovulation, where the egg is released. Now, that's what's happening biologically, but what does that mean for us? Well, as estrogen rises, it peaks just before ovulation, when, evolutionary speaking, would be the time when we need to go and find a mate to fertilize that egg. As I said, nowadays it's not quite so simple or necessary every month to do that. But estrogen is a feel-good hormone. It increases the amount of serotonin that we have. Serotonin is a feel-good hormone as well. It elevates mood. Estrogen makes us feel energetic, enthusiastic, motivated for life. And when estrogen is high, a lot of women will feel brilliant. Now, because hormones get a bad rep, sometimes women don't even tap into the fact that on their brilliant days, when they feel like they're just nailing life, whether they're acing it in school, their relationships with their peers are going brilliantly, they're just, kind of feel energetic. That kind of is just down to, yeah, well, I'm just brilliant. When the bad stuff starts happening premenstrually, for example, and they become emotional and tearful, that's when they blame their hormones. But one of the things we want to do is really get athletes to tap into how their hormones are making them feel across the whole cycle, because there is a really strong likelihood that in that first phase of the cycle, you will be able to use the effects of your hormones to your benefit. If you're feeling brilliant and energetic, you will feel more confident that you can put more effort into training. You might add another rep on if you're doing intervals or weight training. Tapping into those times when your hormones are helping you be a performer is really important. So estrogen rises on its way to ovulation, and then as it peaks, that's the signal to the body to release the egg from the follicle, and as I say, release it in the hope that it's going to be fertilized by some incoming sperm. And once the egg has been released, the follicle that contained it starts to produce progesterone, which is the line that you see rising in the second half of the cycle, the luteal phase. And progesterone is a pro-gestation hormone, so it sort of is pro-pregnancy. It's setting your body up to be pregnant. As I said, you've released the egg, you're hoping it's going to be fertilized. So progesterone helps sustain the lining of the uterus, and also has influences on our physiology, which kind of make us be less energetic and enigmatic, because now we've got pregnant, thank you very much, and it's more of a nesting hormone, so it has more of a soothing influence on our central nervous system. It helps us sleep better. We want to be nice and recovered if we're just about to become pregnant. So we know that we can get to sleep quicker and sleep more deeply when progesterone is high. So if estrogen is kind of stimulating things to be energetic and enthusiastic, progesterone is calming them and soothing them. And you might think, oh, why would that be useful for an athlete? But sleep is brilliant for an athlete, obviously. And I always think that if you do find you sleep better in the second half of your cycle, if you go to bed knowing that your body is kind of designed right now to help you sleep, then you might like you get sleep quicker and get better recovery. If you're someone who finds that they are a little bit anxious, these are times of your cycle when you might actually not feel quite so on edge, and you can use that to your advantage. And if the egg does not become fertilized because you haven't found your mate and you don't want to become pregnant, then it doesn't implant in the uterus, and so those hormones which were sort of there to sustain the pregnancy get the signal that this month's not going to happen, and they start to drop off. And it's those declining hormones which is called the premenstrual phase, because those decline of hormones happen just before you get your period. And it's often the decrease and the sort of drop off in hormone, which is why we get some of those symptoms that you might associate with the premenstrual phase, like being emotional, being tired, having migraines or headaches, having different cravings for food. The low mood part is because you can see that estrogen has had a second peak in the second half of the cycle. So the serotonin has been produced, and the progesterone is nice and soothing for your nervous system. And you take all those things away, and you often get low mood associated because you've taken the good mood hormones away, you've taken the soothing hormones away. So that's why we can feel quite sensitive and emotional in that period of time. And then you kind of go back to the beginning of your cycle. So the day one of when you bleed, your period, is the first day of your cycle. So we count that as day one. So if you're trying to count how long your or your daughter cycle is, you start the first day of her period is day one, and then obviously that goes up to the day before the first day of her next period, and that's the duration of her menstrual cycle. Now the period itself is a time when different things are happening. So even though the hormones are very low and they're not having much of an influence, menstruation itself can be tricky to manage, especially when you've just started your periods. You're still getting to grips with using period products, finding the right period product for your that suits you and that suits the activities you're doing. If you have heavy periods, then you can be more at risk of becoming anemic, and so it's really important to look at whether there are signs of things like lethargy and fatigue in girls who are having heavy periods, because they might need some help with their iron. And you can also be really tired generally at this time, and it might be that you need to build in more recovery. Other people find their period quite an exhilarating time, because if they're someone who has a bad time in the premenstrual phase with symptoms like being emotional, feeling bloated, having headaches, then when the period arrives, that's kind of like a sense of relief, and they move into the next phase of the cycle. So all of those things, you can imagine, if we ignored them, we'd be ignoring a massive part of what makes our athletes who they are, and we'll be ignoring what makes them feel brilliant. We know that estrogen is an anabolic hormone, so it helps the body build muscles, so that might help an athlete when they're thinking about strength training. It's a great time to have constructive, kind of reflective conversations without people being defensive or emotional. You might have heard the link between high estrogen and injury. Now we do know that estrogen affects the collagen which in the ligaments in joints, and it can make joints more lax, but we don't know exactly how important that is as a risk factor for injury. It's not the only risk factor. Injuries happen because of a sort of colossal storm of events, whether that's fatigue, with bad technique, with something unexpected happening. And if you add in high levels of estrogen, you might be adding another risk factor in, which contributes to the injury. But we're not entirely sure about how strong that connection is yet. But we do certainly see athletes who, if they've got a niggle, in their lower back, or they tendency to have a tight hamstring or a sore shoulder, the flare-ups can be cyclical and they can be related to their cycle. And that's really important to recognize, because if you've got an athlete who's on the physio bed and the physio is looking for a musculoskeletal cause for this injury, and then it kind of dies down and it flares up again, and they're looking, and everyone's getting quite anxious, they don't know what's happening. If you can relate it to the cycle, you can start to relate it to the fact that hormones might be influencing joint laxity in this athlete and causing them that niggle, causing them some tightness somewhere else, and you start to be able to explain what's happening. In that second phase, as I said, it can affect your central nervous system. It can be calming. It can affect digestion. So people can become constipated in this part of the cycle, or digestion just feels slow and you feel bloated. And for athletes, that's really important. Being bloated can affect how you look, but it can also affect your body weight. And both of those things might be important for athletes. So if they know it's to do with their cycle and they know it's going to last a couple of days, that's much easier to kind of be kind to yourself in your head than thinking, oh God, I'm just too heavy, or oh, look at me, I don't look like an athlete in my workout gear today. Knowing that it's just related to that day of the cycle is sometimes allows athletes to be more compassionate for themselves. And in the second half of your cycle, your base temperature, core temperature, goes up, and it can go up by about 0.5 degree. And this is really important. I mean, canoeists probably spend a lot of their time being freezing cold. I was at Lee Valley a couple of weeks ago speaking to some of the girls, and it was the worst, coldest, rainy day I've ever had. And they were still out on the water, so I was very impressed. But when you do get to be an athlete exercising in hot conditions, the fact that you're starting with a higher core temperature than you might be in the first half of your cycle will affect your thermal perception. That's how hot you feel. And that's really important, because how hot we feel influences how hard we want to push ourselves, how much effort we want to exert before we overheat. And just knowing that if, for example, we're talking to lots of teams going to Tokyo and having to prepare to compete in really hot and humid conditions, if athletes go knowing they're in the second phase of their cycle and they do tend to feel hotter in that phase, we're just working with them to provide better cooling strategies. They are using ice vests, they're using cold towels more strategically than they might do if they're in the first half of their cycle. And then, as I said, as those hormones drop off, that can be times when we feel stressed or anxious, unhappy, vulnerable. That is also one of the biggest reported symptoms of the premenstrual phase, is also breast pain. And I'll talk briefly in a minute about getting a really good sports bra, because we know that we can reduce or completely eliminate breast pain in 90% of women by getting a good bra. And on the point of breasts, they can change size and shape during the menstrual cycle. And if you've got a great fitting sports bra, but then for a week of your cycle it doesn't fit because your breasts have changed shape, then you might need to get another bra for that period for it to be supportive enough and to be able to alleviate breast pain. And then, oh, I've gone back to not being able to work my screen. And then during the period, like I said, there might be feelings of fatigue and there might be pain. Our body produces a chemical that are called prostaglandins, and they allow us to have a healthy period. So what they do is they kind of constrict the blood vessels in the lining of the uterus so that it can kind of die off and shed, because that's what's happening at the end of this cycle. The uterus has been built up, ready to implant the pregnancy. It hasn't happened, so our body gets rid of the lining of the uterus as the period, so that the whole cycle can start again. And the chemicals that are involved in making that kind of a healthy experience for our body, if we produce too many of them or are really sensitive to them, they can have effects outside of the uterus, say, for example, in the nearby gut, and they have constricting effects in the gut, which can cause things like diarrhea, nausea. They can cause local inflammation. So those chemicals can be the reason why, when people are having pain, discomfort during the period, that's what's happening. There are things you can do. Just taking non-steroidal anti-inflammatories like ibuprofen or naproxen can really combat the effects of those chemicals, but taking them early, so taking them before you're bent over double with pain, taking them early and consistently through, if it's the days of your period that you get this pain, taking them consistently through that period will help alleviate pain much better than if you wait for the pain to become really bad and then take them. When we did our survey, we found that around the same amount of athletes are having either absent or irregular periods or heavy periods, so different ends of the spectrum there. And briefly, I'll just say that if any athlete is not having a period, that is a sign that she is unhealthy. Having a period, menstruating, has been described as a vital sign of health, because what it gives you an indication of is your body feels healthy enough to reproduce. Because one of the first systems that our body shuts down when we aren't getting enough fuel, getting enough energy, or we're too stressed is our reproductive system, because it thinks, you know what, right now is not a good time to have a baby. I can't function, my physiology isn't functioning properly as it is without trying to sustain life. So losing your period is a really good indication that something's gone wrong. And in athletes, the most common reason that is, unless there's a medical underlying condition, is that they're not fueling correctly. And that might mean the amount they're eating, so the calories, but also really importantly, it might be what they're eating. So eating carbohydrates at the right time is really important. If you go on a very low carbohydrate diet, that can also switch off that kind of signaling pathway for your reproductive system. So not having a period is a sign that we need to do something, and usually with your nutrition or your recovery, or might be some external stress, but a combination of all three is also, equally bad. And the reason it's really important to rectify that as soon as you can is that in the years up until we're 30, women are laying down their bone strength. So estrogen is a really key hormone that helps bones absorb calcium and build bone strength. When we lose our periods, it means that we are losing our menstrual cycle. So estrogen isn't peaking and troughing anymore, it's just flatlining, which means that our bone health is going to suffer because estrogen isn't there to help our bones absorb calcium. And what happens if we're not laying down bone strength in those years when we're meant to be, our decline towards, osteoporosis, which happens later in life to some women, becomes quicker because you haven't built up enough bone strength early in life. And in extreme cases, you start to get sort of really bad bone health right then and there in your 20s. So we've worked with athletes who have missed periods for a number of years before they've ever tried to do anything about it, at which point they have become osteoporotic. So they have osteoporosis in their 20s. And that's really, really, really hard to put right. And then for those who are having heavy periods, like I said, sometimes if you're having a heavy period, you can be at greater risk of anemia because of the blood loss, and therefore it's really important just to recognize the symptoms of that. And managing menstruation when you're having a heavy period is really important to consider. So especially when you're doing something like a water sport, where you might be out on the water for a couple of hours without being able to easily pop into a bathroom. Are you able to use a period product which allows you to do that without sitting in the boat being super anxious that you're leaking? Because I always say, if we can take away any of these layers of anxiety from an athlete, we are giving them some headspace to perform. And worrying that you can't change your period product is something that we can try and fix, rather than just kind of not having the conversation about whether girls feel like they've found the right product and whether they can go for at least a couple of hours without needing to change it. In adolescence, periods can be a lot heavier than they will be for the rest of that girl's life. And another thing to talk to girls about is if they're experiencing heavy, painful periods when they first start, that's not kind of their lot for life, and those cycles can change, and particularly in the first 5 years of having periods, those cycles can change. You don't ovulate every cycle when you're young, and that can contribute to more heavy, painful periods. And then once your body starts to get in a rhythm and is ovulating every month, your periods the symptoms might become much more mild. Going back to that individual nature, one of the things we try and explain to girls is that there is no one alive who is youer than you. Only you are you, and you will have your own experience of this. So it's no good looking at your mate and they say, oh yeah, I've got period pain today, I'm just going to go for a run. And you're thinking, wow, I can't even stand up straight, but maybe I'm just weaker than her, because we're all experiencing our symptoms, the good and the bad, in different ways. And it's really important to be empathetic about that. So not particularly with women, because we've had our own experience and we find that sometimes we can impose that on others. So if you've got a girl who's saying, my legs feel really leaden, I don't think I can manage that interval session today, and you're someone who's never experienced that, you might say, well, I had period pain when I was younger, I just got on with it. So it's kind of about shifting to a bit of empathy and working with the athlete and how they feel, while still trying to fulfill your commitments to training and adaptation and recovery. And just to give you an idea about how individual it is, these menstrual cycle monitoring app collected the symptoms that were most frequently reported in the premenstrual phase. That's in the days before you have your period. Now, some women would describe symptoms in that time as increase in anxiety, crying, depression, fatigue, irritability. And then another woman would be in the same phase of their cycle, and they would say they're energetic, they're motivated, they're social, they're relaxed. So those two individuals are, feeling completely different, yet they're both in the same phase of their cycle. And that's how different we can experience our cycle. So it's also really important to talk to girls, athletes, about their cycle and how they're experiencing it. Otherwise, we might be sort of superimposing our own view on it, and it can become a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy if you say, oh, you always get moody before your period. Well, you might be working with an athlete, or your daughter might be someone who doesn't. So it's just really, really important that we understand the individual in front of us rather than this sort of generic template of what a cycle looks and feels like. Just a couple of other facts about the menstrual cycle. Menarche, which is where you start your periods, typically occurs around 12 years. It can occur before that. It can occur as early as 9. It can occur as late as 15. But if by 15 you've got a daughter who hasn't started her periods, then it's probably best to just seek some medical advice about whether that's still healthy. Because again, if you're getting energy balance wrong before you've started your periods, your body might just not start your menstrual cycle. And a good indication of when periods start is around 2.5 years after the breasts start to bud and breast development becomes obvious. Cycles can be longer in adolescence, so cycles can be anywhere between 20 and 45 days and still considered normal, and they can be longer in adolescence. That first half of the cycle is the bit that's longer. And the menstrual cycle changes across the lifespan, and as they change in their first 5 years of having periods, they will also change after you've had babies, and then obviously in the years leading up to menopause they change again, and everyone's unique. I will just quickly mention the pill, because we know that 50% of our athletes who we surveyed in our world-class programs were taking hormonal contraception. Now, the most common form of hormonal contraception they were taking was the combined oral contraceptive pill, but they were also using progesterone-only pill, also known as the mini pill, and the Mirena coil, which is an intrauterine device, so it's inserted vaginally and local to the uterus. The important thing to know about the pill, without getting into what's best and what's right and wrong, is that you don't have a menstrual cycle when you're on the pill. This graph shows, in a slightly more academic way, the peak of estrogen in the blue line, and then the peak of progesterone in the green line that I showed you as being a normal cycle. What your natural estrogen and progesterone does when you take the pill, which is a synthetic hormone, is your natural estrogen and progesterone flatlines. So it's just important for people to recognize they are not having a menstrual cycle. Their body isn't preparing for pregnancy and then not getting pregnant and having a period and starting all again. It's just kind of being tricked into thinking it's pregnant all the time, and your natural hormones are suppressed. Now, the reason that's really important for girls to know is because when you have menstruation or a bleed during your pill taking, that is not a period. And the reason that's important is because when I said the period is a vital sign of health and it can tell you whether you're getting your energy balance right, the bleed you have when you're on the pill doesn't do that. It's not an indication of that. So if you're someone who's taking a pill and getting a bleed, every 20, after day 21 of your cycle, you get a bleed on your non-pill taking days. You think, oh, that's brilliant. I've got a really healthy cycle. I'm having a regular period. Everything must be fine. That's not what's happening. What you're doing is you're taking synthetic hormones, and then when you stop taking them, which you do, you have break between packets, or sometimes your pill might be that you take a sugar pill for 7 days. You have a little withdrawal bleed as your body responds to those chemicals being taken away, and then you take the pill again and the bleed stops. So it's just because we've had some athletes who said, oh, I have a regular period, I must be super healthy. They're on the pill, they're not having a period. We've had lots of athletes reporting that they have a menstrual cycle, but then we find out they're on the pill. You can still get symptoms on the pill as well. So the pill isn't always the greatest solution for those who are having severe symptoms. Sometimes it can be a brilliant solution. sometimes it can produce its own symptoms that can be exactly the same as symptoms some people experience when they're having a menstrual cycle, like headaches, like bloatedness, like fatigue, like brain fog, all of those things. So what we suggest is, as well as monitoring your cycle when you're having a menstrual cycle, if you're coming on or off the pill, or even if you're on it now, if your daughters are on it now, you can also monitor your symptoms, because it probably is important for you to recognize, particularly as an athlete, whether if you get any symptoms from taking the pill, and whether you're kind of willing to accept those. Are they better than you were getting when you're having a menstrual cycle? Now, obviously, the main reason for taking the pill is a contraceptive, and we always say that unwanted pregnancy is the worst performance impacting thing that you can have. But equally, we know lots of athletes are taking the oral contraceptive pill not just as contraceptive, but as a way to sort of command and control their cycle. And so it's just worth knowing kind of some of the elements that I've explained there. We know that lots of athletes report breast pain whilst exercising, and it interferes with their ability to give 100% during training. And that's why a really good sports bra is really important. And again, we do not get educated on this as girls, as parents, and we're doing a great project with the University of Portsmouth and their research group there. If you visit their website, they've got some great resources on how to fit a bra correctly. And it is not, as some of us have been led to believe, a lady in Marks and Spencer's with her tape measure around your bust. Fitting a bra requires you to look at 5 different points that include things like the underband. That's the bit underneath the breast, which is meant to support the weight of the breast. It's meant to look at how the cup fits around your breast, how the middle of the bra is sitting against your skin, how the straps are working. You're not meant to hang your breasts off the straps of a bra. It's meant to be supported from the underband. So all of those things are really important. And if you think just because you're not running, so you're not doing a high impact sport when you're in a boat, the torso movement that your girls do mean that breast movement will be loads if you're not in a good fitting bra. And breast movement is bad for skin health, because our breasts are essentially fatty and lymph tissue that are not being supported by muscle. There's a muscle behind it, but it's not holding the weight of the breast. So the breast is just being held by skin. And if it's allowed to move, that really deteriorates the health of the skin, and you start to get stretch marks just from the movement. It can also cause breast pain, but there's performance impact from having too much breast movement that you get with an ill-fitting bra. And those things can be things like different muscle activation as a consequence of trying to counteract this movement. More muscle activation requires more energy, so movements start to become more energy consuming. But you don't want that as an athlete. A good example in running is that it shortens your stride length, so it affects your gait, it affects your posture, and there's no reason to suggest that those things that we found in running wouldn't translate into other people executing skill should they be having breast movement, when they can actually get a really great fitting bra and reduce that. We had a survey done at the Commonwealth Games which suggested that 40% of our female athletes were experiencing urinary incontinence. What that means is that during high impact manoeuvres like jumping, skipping, running, changes of direction, they were unable to keep urine in. So they had a small leak of urine, which is what stress incontinence is. Now that's really, really important. And just because your girls, again, are sitting or kneeling in boats, they will still be in the gym, probably doing plyometric exercises and really strong weights exercises eventually as their program progresses, and stress incontinence can happen during those times as well. And if it does, it is a really important signal, again, that there is dysfunction, that we're not healthy. So one of the main reasons why we have stress incontinence in young female athletes, bearing in mind they are not postnatal middle-aged women, who it is normal to experience stress incontinence. It's not normal for you to continue to experience stress incontinence when you're middle-aged, but after pregnancy, it's quite normal. For young, fit female athletes, it's not, and it's for a different reason. When you're pregnant, your pelvic floor gets stretched, your pelvic floor is affected through you giving birth. Young athletes haven't had any of this, and what they sometimes have is an overactivation of their pelvic floor. So they are so used to it being switched on. You know, when they're doing weights, when they're having to do what we call a Valsalva maneuver, where they're holding tension in their torso to be able to lift weights, they're activating their core really well, but then their brain forgets to switch it off. And as a consequence, it becomes super tight, but then it also becomes very fatigued and can fail. But the treatment for an overactive pelvic floor is different from the treatment from a loose, relaxed pelvic floor. So if you have stress incontinence in young athletes, it's really important you go and see a women's health physio, and she can do a really good pelvic floor exam and give some really good advice on how to combat if it is indeed overactivity, so that you get really good core control back, because it can not just affect, you know, the embarrassing situation of having leakage, but it can cause pelvic pain, can cause pain during sex, it can cause pain around the rectum, it can cause constipation, IBS, hemorrhoids, it can even transfer to low back pain. So an overactive pelvic floor is really important to get seen to, and if our data is correct, is experienced by quite a large portion of athletes. The last stat I have is taken from a survey of dads of girls, and it's just to point out that 50% of dads never get taught about periods at school, and 50% of dads in this survey hadn't ever spoken to their daughters about periods. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to give people the confidence to just open up the conversation. And I use dads as an example because we know that most of our girls are coached by men. We know that sport at the moment, coaches in sport at the moment are still predominantly male. So you've got middle-aged men teaching and coaching young women, and obviously your parents of those athletes. We want to create a space where we open up the conversation. And one of the biggest barriers when we talk to coaches and parents is that they don't feel confident enough about what's happening in the menstrual cycle and premenstrually and during periods to be able to just feel relaxed enough to have a conversation. But really, it's just about saying, how are you? How are you feeling? What's going on for you? And for the girls to feel relaxed enough to be able to share, because they're also usually mortified. So it's how you create a space that allows them to share. And I like this slide because I love Star Wars for a start, but also because it kind of depicts where we're at the moment in terms of the culture of sport and talking about these things, whether it's menstrual cycle, periods, stress incontinence, breast pain, in that we're not listening to it, we're not talking about it, and we're pretending not to see it. With the stress incontinence example, we asked the doctors how many stress incontinence cases were being reported, and there was close to 0. When you ask coaches and athletes whether anyone was wetting themselves, they would say, yeah, most people do it all the time. So we're not talking about it and we're pretending not to see it, so we're normalizing it. We're not working hard enough to kind of create solutions for these girls to allow them to be the best athletes they can be. So we need to stop that. We need to just talk about it. We need to use the words. Doesn't matter if you get them wrong, but we just need to create spaces where they feel like they can open up and talk about anything that they need to, that allows them to be supported in performance. So finally, what should you do with some of that information that I've just thrown at you? So one of the first things I always say to the girls is start tracking your cycle. Knowledge is power, but self-knowledge is empowering. And again, some people assume that because we have periods and menstrual cycles every month, we know exactly what's going on. But life is busy and other things cause us stress and emotion too. And teasing out what is related to our cycle is sometimes hard. And it's really hard to do if you're not writing it down. So tracking your cycle and then empowering the girls to share that with either you as parents or their coaches when it's appropriate. So they won't want to share every detail, but they might want to share what's appropriate and sort of worthwhile for them to share in a coaching performance related scenario. But sharing it is a choice, and we've had coaches or practitioners who have said, I tried to tell the girls to track their cycle and tell me what was happening, and they just looked at me and walked off. Because A, they need to know why it's important to you to know, to be so intrusive on this personal information. They need to know why it's important for them as an athlete, and that you will do something sensitively and impactfully with the information, that you'll use it, not to highlight weakness or not to be silly or crude, but you'll use it to strengthen your relationship and to strengthen her kind of ability to go and train and perform. And you can track in any way you want. There's this sort of myth that it becomes complicated, but there are lots of apps out there. So if that's the way that your daughters like to interface with information and data, then that's fine. I will warn you that some apps sell their data. So you get things like Facebook marketing off the back of where you are in your cycle, which is fairly creepy. And some athletes tend to churn information out back at you. So they'll say, oh, you're in this phase of your cycle. If you're feeling tired, eat some, I don't know, avocado. And whilst that might be helpful, because everyone's experience of the cycle is different, if that's not you, then you either start to feel not normal, or you start to be a self-fulfilling prophecy and be like, well, maybe I am tired and I will eat an avocado. So the iPhone has a menstrual tracker in its health app, just comes for free and allows you to track. The other one I like is Clue. It doesn't sell its data and it doesn't give you too much advice. Other ways you can do it are in your diary or in her diary, on a calendar. It doesn't have to be every day. It can be one word which describes how she's feeling. It can be only when she's feeling symptoms. Any way that allows you to look back and look at things that are cyclical rather than just kind of one-off events. The other important thing is not to believe the hype. So there's been a lot of headlines recently about menstrual cycle tracking and how it's been used to prescribe and tailor training. Now, that is not possible from where I stand right now. We don't have enough evidence to say that, there's a couple of papers that exist about doing strength training at a time when estrogen is high, because we think estrogen helps your muscles recover and helps them build strength more. Now, there's been two papers which said, well, if we do strength training at that time, maybe we'll get stronger athletes out the end of it. One says, yes, we do. And the other says, no, it doesn't make a difference. When you strength train, strength gains are still the same. But there's only two papers in like 10 people each. So we don't have enough information. Some of this stuff is really exciting as a prospect, to think that you could start to tweak training and put sessions here or there and get a better response and adaptation because of where your hormones are. But we don't know that at the moment. As I say, the research is just trying to catch up. But what you can do, if you go back a slide, is you track, what your daughter, your athlete looks like. And if she's someone who has debilitating symptoms on one of the days of her cycle, 2 of the days of the cycle, my first thing would be, you need to be diligent about putting in place strategies that help alleviate those symptoms. And what I mean by that is, do not settle for, oh, if painkillers don't work, that's probably your only option. There are loads of things you can do to alleviate menstrual cycle symptoms, and we don't work hard enough to allow girls to have every day of their cycle with mild or no symptoms. And I don't meet many athletes who would say, you know what, if my Olympic final landed on any day of my cycle, I could nail it. And I'm like, well, we need to just look at your cycle and make sure any day is an Olympic final day. So that's where we start. And we also start by saying, if you're having symptoms or you're having, if you're emotional, how do we communicate with you differently? How do we put some yoga into this time of your cycle when we know that this type of yoga helps alleviate period pains? We can work with what we know right now. We don't need to hype up what the research will be able to tell us in the future. So create the right environment so you can start the conversation, create the safe space. Everyone needs educating, so continuing to educate and talk to people, whether it's coaches, whether it's the people who are the S&Cs or the nutritionists or the physios who are working with your daughters, on understanding some of these female specific factors. We always say there's no I in team, don't we? But I really do think that there always is, because everyone is an individual, and in the case of these girls and these women, they're all experiencing things like their cycle differently, and so it's really important we tap into that. 100% get a good bra fit. Make sure they're in the right kit. There's other pieces of equipment that we know have been designed for men and have caused women often serious injury. Some great examples from cycling. But so just make sure they're in the right kit that suits them, suits their size, frame, whatever. And finally, make sure the world around them, the built environment, is friendly towards them. So when men go in the toilet, if they have a space for their urine to go, they have everything they need. When a woman goes in the toilet, she needs somewhere for her wee to go, or anything else she's going to do in there. She needs somewhere to dispose of her period products. She needs toilet roll to wipe, whether she's on her period or not. And if she's got caught short, i.e. her period has started and she didn't expect it, she needs some period products, because otherwise she's walking out of there having her period and having no protection. So make sure you've got all that, and make sure your clubs and the gyms and the venues that your girls are competing and training in have that, and kind of I'm a bit bullish about it, because again, if your daughter is anxious in training because she realized she's come on and there's nothing there for her, nowhere there for her to get a period product without having to ask, then that's a layer of anxiety that you can just take away by having a caught short kit. And consider how you're coaching, and whether you're parenting or females, that your communication, motivation and support might look different in a coaching environment if you're optimizing it for females. And if you've got a mixed group, which we often have, that you might need to subtly tweak it towards the individual and how they're responding. And with a female, how she's responding at different times of her cycle. So I appreciate that's a whiz through. I've probably gone over time because I do like to natter about this, but I'm happy to answer any questions, or if you're tired and you want your dinner, you can see my contact details there, and I'm happy if you want to follow up with me, that's fine. Thanks.
So thank you, Emma, for delivering that really insightful webinar today. Now's an opportunity to ask any specific questions around this topic area. So please feel free to use that chat feature, and the next sort of 5 minutes or so, Emma will be able to answer any questions that you might have. Whilst we just wait if there are any questions that come through, we did have one question that come through in the pre-webinar sign-up. This question was directed more towards the England Talent Programme, and that question was, how is the coaching development pathway being supported to understand factors in female training? So the answer to that is, obviously this is a new and emerging area of focus for us, and within all sports actually. And as a group of coaches, both talent and world-class programme coaches, they've been involved in more in-depth presentations delivered by Emma herself actually, and will continue to be supported through CPD opportunities from the coach developer, and with ongoing links that we have with Emma and her work. So we'll continue to sort of develop and explore this further as a group of coaches with the support network that we have. We did have one question that was sent through during the chat, Emma, and that was around the pill and the combined pill. Is it detrimental to muscle mass, function and bone strength?
So it's a really good question, because when you see that flat line of estrogen when people are taking the pills, you would naturally think, wow, okay, so you're not getting the lovely peaks of estrogen, and so therefore it's not helping bone health, it's not helping build muscle. Unfortunately, just going back to this research gap, we don't have the research that can tell us definitively whether it does or doesn't affect either short-term muscle gain or long-term bone health. What we do know is that when athletes have gone on the pill, who are really good at tracking their training progress and everything else like that, there's been a couple of cases where they've noticed they haven't been able to sustain muscle mass as well when they've gone on the pill. They've come off the pill and they have. So I would treat it as a very individual thing. There are no set rules because we don't have the evidence, but certainly in terms of gaining muscle mass and keeping muscle mass, if your daughters go on the pill and suddenly see a change, then it's really worth thinking about what the interaction might be. In terms of long-term bone health, the researchers that we work with do have some concerns, but they just can't prove it yet. And I think overall we must accept that at the moment we don't have any evidence to the contrary.
Yeah, thanks for that. I've got another question actually. What sort of strategies can parents use during high periods of emotion for the female athlete? So also particularly when this could be also a stressful period of such as selection and stuff like that. So what sort of strategies can parents use?
Yeah, so I think there's probably two things that I would say. Is one, if you recognize that your daughter is emotional, and particularly emotional at different times of the cycle, don't choose that moment to kind of engage with it and say, oh, you know, you're really emotional. Use a time, you know, let that go, you know, let her have her period, let her estrogen rise again, and wait till she's in a more positive state, and say, you know, did you, you know, how were you feeling during that time? I could tell it was really tough. Is there anything I can do? And sort of have the conversation outside of that time. But also, I think in that moment is just leaning into it with some compassion, because it's real. And I'm a parent of small children, so I know this is hard. But knowing that that's not them as a person, you know, that's not the person you've raised being angry or rude or frustrated or anxious. You know, that's just them right then, and that's their physiology affecting their kind of emotion and their psychology. So leaning into that and just saying, I know this must be really hard for you right now, and kind of not clashing with it, I think is really important. And when you're in pressure situations like sport, when you want people to do what you need them to do, whether you're a parent encouraging your daughter or a coach encouraging your athlete, it's really easy to kind of revert back to, don't talk to me like that, come on, pull your socks up, and all of those sort of cliches. And actually, what we need to recognize is that when people are emotionally vulnerable, especially in those stages, is for us to lean into it and say, oh, this must be really tough for you, let's work it out together. I don't know if that's any help.
Yeah, that's great tips there. Thank you. Thanks for that. I've got one final question before, if anyone else does have any other questions, if you just want to drop that in the chat. But I'll just end with one final question to you, Emma. What sort of impact does the menstrual cycle have on injury risk?
Great question. We know that girls and women are, I think it's 6 times more likely to have an ACL injury than men. And ACL is usually from change direction or high impact work. So usually in games play or things like that, gymnastics. Now that isn't all down to hormones. Hormones might play a part. We also know that the anatomy of a woman is different. So the width of her hip in relation to the width of her knees, there's a greater angle there than there is in men, and that makes us more susceptible to injury. We really don't know the effect of time of cycle on injury risk. Because we only have retrospective information. So we ask athletes, for example, who have had catastrophic injuries like ACL tears, where were you in your cycle? And that's not particularly reliable data. So we're waiting for better information to come out about that. But like I said in my talk, I think one of the things we can recognize is that there will be athletes whose injuries or niggles flare up in a cyclical way that will be related to their menstrual cycle. And because this is so individual, not everyone will have that, but some might. And that's when you can work with the physio, and you might put some more taping or strapping on at a given time of the cycle, just to alleviate some, because, you know, if you've got more lax joints and your pelvis is tilting slightly differently, or your shoulder is rotating slightly differently, then in some people that can cause, you know, niggles, tension, high propensity for injury. But we're not quite sure how strong the relationship is. So it's just, I think it's really important for your girls to track their cycle and track those sort of things as well, when they're getting niggles, when they're getting pains, when they're getting sore joints, and see if you can marry the two up.
Yeah, so thanks there for that, Emma. So what I'll do is I'll bring this webinar to a close now. So thank you once again, Emma, for delivering this webinar this evening. So this webinar will be uploaded onto the Talent Parent Programme webpage sometime next week, and additional resources around this sort of topic area will also get uploaded onto the Talent Parent Programme webpage, and also signposted to you yourselves as talent parents when we have more resources available to you. So thank you once again, Emma, for delivering the webinar this evening.
Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.